Welcome. Today is Wednesday, November 1st, 2017, and this is the NHERI Early Career Researcher Forum. This forum is intended to foster the exchange of ideas and be a platform of best practices for successful research. It is intended to highlight compelling research, build up the natural hazards engineering student community, and provide presentation opportunities. For more information, visit the NHERI website at DesignSafe-CI.org, where you can find links to the SimCenter and the NHERI Learning Center. Today's webinar is coordinated by the Natural Hazards Engineering Research Infrastructures Simulation and Computational Modeling Center. This webinar is supported by the National Science Foundation under awards 1612843 and 1520817. Any statements in this webinar are those of the presenter and do not necessarily represent the views of the National Science Foundation. Today's presentation is by Sean Shin. He is a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Washington. He received a bachelor's degree in ocean engineering from Shanghai Jiaotong University in China in 2014. His primary areas of research are numerical modeling of tsunami inundation and the impact on coastal structures using large-scale supercomputers. Recently, he has also been working on accelerating tsunami analyses with graphical processor units. Sean is co-advised by Michael Motley, Randall Levesque, and Frank Gonzalez. The title of his presentation is Multi-Scale Modeling of a 500-Year Cascadia Subduction Zone Tsunami Inundation, including the constructed environment. And Sean, I invite you to begin.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. So my name is Xinsheng Qing, and I'm fourth-year PhD student at University of Washington, Seattle. And I'm co-advised by Michael Motley, Randall Levesque, and Frank Gonzalez. And today I'm going to present my work on comparing a 2D and a 3D tsunami inundation model with the constructed environment. And specifically, it's a 500-year Cascadia Subduction Zone tsunami. And as you may still remember, in the past several decades, there are several huge tsunamis that took tens of thousands of people's lives. And the most recent one is the Japan 2011 tsunami. And the dark strip in this figure shows all areas in the world that is prone to tsunami hazard. And note that the west coast of the United States is also in this region. And so the figure on the left show what a subduction zone is, or where are the subduction zones in the world by red solid line. And specifically, there is a subduction zone on the west coast of the United States, or the west of North American plate. And here we show what a Cascadia subduction zone is. So it's where the Pacific plate interact with the North American plate, and you can see on this figure on the left, the Pacific plate is moving toward the North American plate, and there's a rupture between the two plates denoted by the red solid line in this figure. And if such a subduction zone, if an earthquake happens in such a subduction zone, we are expected to have a very huge tsunami. And it is reported that magnitude 9 tsunami earthquake is very likely to happen in the next several decades. And the Washington states, Oregon state, and California states are all possible to be affected by such an earthquake and the tsunami generated by such an earthquake. So that's why we would like to study this Cascadia subduction zone. And here these figures show some very severe damage from tsunami events, and you can see how powerful a wave generated by tsunami can be. And here the figure on the left shows a bridge damage destroyed by tsunami, and a bridge is very critical after a tsunami, because like we want to transport water and food into the region. But if the bridge is damaged, then it's hard to get those things into the region. And the figure on the top right also shows a building actually move away by several meters, by the tsunami wave. And you can also see how powerful a tsunami wave can be. And so we would like to be able to predict, to model the tsunami inundation, or be able to predict the impact from a tsunami to those coastal structures, such that when we design, say, a bridge, we would like to design it such that it can survive a tsunami. Then we can transport water and food into the region after a tsunami. And we also would like to design some critical building like hospital, such that it is strong enough to survive a tsunami, because people in a hospital is not very likely to be able to run away from the region after a tsunami, when a tsunami comes. And here, a tsunami actually consists of several steps, and here I divided it into 4 steps. So the first step is the tsunami generation. So a tsunami. So here we were talking about tsunami generated by an earthquake under the sea, and after that it will propagate toward the shoreline. And then after it arrives the shoreline, we have inland inundation of a tsunami. And then after that, the tsunami will interact with coastal structures like bridge and buildings inland. And the scale of these steps actually decrease from very large, which is in the tsunami generation step, to quite small in the interaction with structural step. And usually when we model the first 2 steps, people would use, would solve 2D shallow water equations, which is much less computational expensive than what is typically used in modeling the last step, that is the 3 Navier-Stokes equation. Here, our focus is actually on the offshore propagation, inland inundation, and interaction with structures. So since the case we are considering actually consists of 3 steps in this out of those 4, it's not very clear that whether we should use a 2D shallow water equation to model this or the 3D Navier-Stokes equation. So in this study, I'm going to present my result of using both the 2D shallow water equation to model the 3 steps and the 3D Navier-Stokes equation to model these 3 steps. Okay, and specifically, we built a model on a case of Seaside, Oregon. So the 2 figures on the left are top view of the city Seaside in Oregon, and you can see it's right next to the Pacific Ocean. And the figure on the right shows the geographic location of Seaside, and it's very close to Portland and Seattle. Okay, the reason why we chose this case study is that we have some experimental data by some researchers at Oregon State University who did a series of experiments several years ago, and they built a physical model of part of the city Seaside in their numerical wave basin. And here is a snapshot of the experiment, from the experiment, and you can see a single peak tsunami wave is coming toward us, and it's going to hit the buildings categorized by 3 different colors, red, blue, and yellow. Okay, so the figure on the left shows the yellow rectangle on the figure on the left shows the region where we are going to model. And this is also the region that the physical experiment modeled. And a wave of 10 meters high is going to enter the region from its left boundary and it's going to hit the buildings in the small yellow rectangle on the right. And it's the length of the rectangle is about 2 kilometers, and it's about 1.5 kilometers wide. And it's a 1.50 scale model. So the wave in the experiment is actually only 20 centimeters, which corresponds to a 10 meters wave in prototype. And when we use our 2D and 3D model to model this scenario, and ideally we would like to have our numerical model model the same region or the same domain as in the physical experiment. This is true for the 2D model, but it turns out if we try to put everything, if we try to put the entire rectangle into the 3D model, is just too expensive. And I will show you how expensive it is in the next several slides. So we actually come up with a different strategy when we use the 3D model to model this domain. And here is, so in the experiment, they measured velocity and wave height at several locations. So here you can see on the right, you can see A2, A3, A1, A2, A3 until A9, and B1, B2 until B9, C1 until C9, D1 to D4. So those are 31 locations where they measure those flow parameters. So those are the places where we would like our numerical model to be able to predict the same flow parameters. So so now let's say if we would like to predict flow parameters at A1 and A9, we carefully chose a subsection of the rectangular region, and here I denoted by blue dash line. And so we use our 3D model to only model this subsection to get flow parameters at A1 to A9. So in this way, we don't have to model the entire rectangular region. And you can see we repeat this process for other groups of gauges or other group of places where we want to predict flow parameters. So this the green dash line here shows a long thin subsection by modeling which we predict flow parameters at gauge B1, B2 until B9, and we repeat the same strategy for prediction of flow parameters from C1 to C9, and the last is D1 until D4. So this is a summary of the 4 subsections that we carefully chose to model in order to get prediction of flow parameters at all 31 places. By doing this, we don't have to model the entire rectangular region at once, which is impractical with the computational resource we have at hand. And here is a summary or a comparison of the 2 models that we use. And so for the 2D model, we solve the shallow water equations, and we use the package called GeoClaw, which is a sub-package of ClawPack developed by Randall Levac at University of Washington. And specifically, we use a mesh technique called adaptive mesh refinement, which refine only places where we need higher resolution, and it actually automatically refine the grid or regenerate grid at every several time step. So you can imagine as the front of the wave or the front of the tsunami ball moves, it automatically refine where near those places where you know we should have final grid, and that's the good thing about using adaptive mesh refinement. And it turns out it actually save us a lot of computational efforts. And so specifically for this case, we model the entire rectangular region, and it takes only 5 to 6 hours on my own laptop. And the 3D model is, on the other hand, is much more expensive. And it's not because we are solving the Navier-Stokes equation with Rand's model. It's also because we are not using adaptive mesh refinement. So the mesh we are using here is just regular unstructured mesh, where in which you refine wherever you think you need final mesh during the simulation, and the mesh is just static during the whole simulation. And we use open source, quite famous open source CFD package called OpenFOAM. And here you can see the computational time is 8 to 10 days with 128 computer cores in parallel. So a CPU on a supercomputer typically will have 16 cores. So 128 computer cores means 8 supercomputers. And in the last column, I actually roughly evaluate the floating operations, number of floating point operations in both model. And you can see in terms of floating point operations, the 3D model can be 10,000 times more expensive than the 2D model. Okay, so on this slide, I'm showing the results, the prediction of flow parameters at B2. And the first row is the water depth, and the second row is velocity. And the third row is momentum flux, which is computed from multiplying water depth with velocity square. And here you see, let's have a look at the first row. Here you see the solid line is the experimental measurement. And you can see both the 3D model and the 2D model actually agree quite well with the experimental data. And for the velocity, for the prediction of velocity, here you, both the blue solid line and the red dashed line are from experimental measurement. And here you can see in terms of the peak value, the 3D model, which is the cross, actually is much closer to the peak, closer than the 2D model, the 2D geocloud model. And since the momentum flux is computed from water depth and velocity, you can also, so it is also expected that the 3D model actually agree better with the experimental data in terms of the peak value. So here we are showing prediction of flow parameters around at two other locations. And also you can see at B3, the 3D model is obviously much better than the 2D model in terms of water level and velocity. And at location D2, especially for the prediction of velocity, you can see the 2D model actually is quite bad at predicting velocities at D2. This is because all location, all A1 to A9, B1 to B9, and C1 to C9 are all along like a street, but D1 and D2 and D2 is behind a building where the flow can be much more complex, and the 2D model actually has some difficulty predicting flow parameters there. And there's a very interesting, so we know that there's a very interesting discrepancy in velocity. So here we show the prediction of velocity at gauge A3. And here you can see, so the peak value from the 3D model actually is much higher than the peak value from the experiment. And we actually have a quite interesting finding about this. So here you should know that the experimental measurement are represented by both the solid line and red dash line. And here is how they got the red dash line from the experiment. And so in the experiment, when they get data represented by black dash line, it is the measurement from the velocimeter. But the data here represented by red dash line is not from the velocimeter, because in the experiment, because in the experiment there are so many error in chain in the edge of the ball, so the velocimeter actually failed to record the results consistently between different trials. So here is how they get the data represented by red dash line instead. So here, if you have a look at the figure on the right, so let's say the green solid line represent position of the ball edge at time t1, and after a second, it moves to the position represented by the purple solid line. So let's call that time t2, and the way they get the position of the edge of the ball at every moment by taking photos or videotaping it, and the way they estimate the velocity here is they compare the distance between two different edges, and then divide that by difference in time. So the expression they use is u equals the position of leading edge at time t2 and minus position of leading edge at time t1, and then divide that by how long it takes. So that's how they get the peak value of velocity here, represented by so I use a red dot to represent the 2.2 meters in the figure. And however, in the CFD model, in the 3D model, we actually, so the result you see here, the peak value of from OpenFOAM, that value is not from this approach. It's actually just from direct measurement, which we are able to do in numerical simulation. And so here if we use the same approach as they use in the experiment, where so here you can see if we cut a slice along gauge A1 to A9, and then so the figure on the left shows the profile of the wave if we cut a slice through A1 until A9, and the figure on the left snapshot of the simulation at two different time steps. And here again, we can using a similar idea, we can get the location of leading edge at T1 and a location of the leading edge at T2. And using a similar idea, if we estimate the peak velocity by doing the same algebra, we actually get exactly the same results, which is 2.2 meters per second. And so this, if we do this, the numerical prediction actually agree quite well with the experimental measurement in terms of the peak value. Okay, but in fact, the results I'm showing here has a peak value of 2.8 meters per second. So why is that, and where is it coming from? So if you have a look at the figure on the left again, and so the two snapshots are all colored by velocity, and you can see there's a dark region, quite dark region after the leading edge of the ball, which means if you put a wave velocimeter there, and after the leading edge of the ball have already passed it, you will get 2.8 meters per second sometime after that. So that's why we get 2.8 meters per second in the numerical model, because we consistently using a pseudo velocimeter in the numerical experiment to get to measure velocity at the place we want. Okay, so as you have seen, the 3D model is so expensive. It's 10,000 times more expensive than the 2D model, and you also see that at some of the locations, the 2D model is actually not that bad. So why do we still want to use the 3D model? So one important reason is that the 3D model actually can predict tsunami forces on structure directly, because we are solving for pressure field, and if you integrate pressure on those structures, you get tsunami forces. But for the 2D model, we can't get tsunami forces on those structures directly. And here I'm showing time history of tsunami forces on some buildings in this region, and here you can see we can see the peak value of forces on building number 1 and building number 2 is quite high compared to other buildings. This is obvious because it's in front of all other buildings. And here if we compare the peak forces on this building number 1 and convert it to prototype scale, we get 55,000 kilonewtons. And if we compare this to seismic load due to maximum considered earthquake for this building, and it turns out if you design this building such that it can survive on earthquake, and you only have to make it to withstand about 3,000 kilonewtons tsunami load, which means you have to strengthen the building by around 15 times if you want this building to stand there after a tsunami wave like this. And here we are also able to predict, with the 3D model, we are also able to predict localized forces on structures. So here the figure on the left shows tsunami forces on each wall of building number 2, and especially you can see so the black dashed line correspond to tsunami forces on the southward of this building, which points up, and the orange storyline is peak forces is force on the north wall of this building, which is pointing down. And you can see the two forces actually cancel each other out. But this figure also shows that it is important to compute forces on individual on components of a structure, because if you only have a look at the total force, the two as in this example, two forces cancel each other out, and you didn't know like forces on individual of them can be large, and they can be destroyed by the tsunami, and which can affect the property of the entire structure and cause some critical damage. And also and obviously the 3D model can give more details. So this is a comparison of a snapshot from experiment and a 3D model. And you can see they look pretty similar, and the 3D model actually gives you a lot of details. And here I'm showing the animation from both the 2D and 3D models. And for the 3D model, it's only a subsection of the entire domain. And we have 4 subsections like this. And for the 2D model, you can see it's actually able to model the entire domain, the entire rectangular domain at one time. Okay, so here are the conclusions from this study. And so first of all, so when you use the 3D model to model a tsunami inundation region, and if the 3D model is too expensive to model the entire region as a whole, we can think about using modeling only subsections. And we have shown that if you choose the subsection carefully enough, you can do it actually with much less computational resources. You can do it much faster without loss of accuracy in where you want to predict, in areas where you want to predict flow parameters, or where you want information from the model. And the second is that such 500 years Cascadia tsunami can actually cause very severe damage to buildings, as you have already seen. For the building number 1 and building number 2, it can be destroyed. It's very obviously that it will be destroyed by a building according to the false predictions. And the third, so the 3D model, one good thing about the 3D model over the 2D model is that it can give direct prediction of tsunami loads on those structures, which can give very useful advice on when design those buildings or design the coastal structures. And the 2D model, although it's less accurate, you can see it's not that bad, and since it can run so fast, and when you need to run the model for many times, such for example, if you want to do some probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment where you need multiple runs, the 2D model can be a very good choice. And I think that's all I have today. Thanks everybody.
Well, thank you, Sean, very much. I want to thank you for your presentation, and at this time we'll begin with the question and answer session. Attendees are reminded that questions should be submitted through the chat panel and sent to the moderator. Sean, we have a couple questions. The first is, could you tell me about the grid size you used for both simulations?
Oh, okay. Let me go to okay, so for the 3D model, the grid is actually, we actually refine the grid a lot near the buildings. And as I remember, if I remember correctly, the size of each, the smallest mesh can be like in the order of centimeters. And for the 2D model, we use adaptive mesh refinement. So it's structural mesh. But we still have a very fine mesh near inland, near the buildings, and I think it's in the order of, I would say in the order of 0.1 meters, or yeah. So it's 10 centimeters. So so the mesh in the 2D model is about 10 times coarser than the mesh in the 3D model. I'm talking about the finest mesh.
Mm-hmm. And another question, is there any experimental data to validate the forces you reported on the structures?
Unfortunately, for this case, no. I think when they did this experiment, they didn't measure forces on these buildings. But we have validated our model, our 3D model, with a simpler case where you have a dam break problem and you have a column downstream, and we have experimental data on that. So we have experimental measurement of forces on that single column, and we actually model that case, and our 3D model actually can predict that force pretty well.
Okay.
But it's a simpler case where you have only one, essentially you have only one column, or you can think of you have only one building there. But in this case, we have hundreds of buildings.
Okay, we have a comment from one of the attendees, Pedro from OSU, who says that they have executed experiments on forces of structures in their wave tank.
I'm sorry. I think I can't hear you. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was simply saying that Pedro from Oregon State has said that they have executed experiments on forces on structures previously. Those were led by Motley, Arduino, and Cox. So
okay.
There are.
But is that on is that from a case where you have only one or two buildings, or?
I'm not sure. We'll have to relay that question to.
Okay. It's okay. Mm-hmm.
So another question, Sean. During a real tsunami, some of the buildings or things in the vicinity of the region are destroyed or flushed downstream, would impact buildings. How would those sorts of interactions with the structures or damage might affect the results of this study?
Actually, so in this study, we actually assume, so for example, let me find a good slide. Yeah, for example, so here in this study, we actually assume all buildings are not won't be destroyed by this tsunami. And if, say, building number 1 and building number 2 are destroyed by this tsunami, and it's carried by the tsunami wave and hit the red buildings behind it, and that's gonna cause I would say that's gonna cause a huge impact on the. You can expect that, right? That's gonna cause a huge impact on the red buildings after the two blue buildings. And unfortunately, currently, we are not able to model this scenario.
Okay. The boundary conditions you used in the video, it showed that you had reflective boundaries, or it seemed to show that you had reflective boundaries. Is that the case?
Yeah. So so the boundary on the left is just an inlet boundary, and all 3 other boundaries are just wall. So you can expect the wave will get reflected when they hit the wall.
Does that impact any of your analyses?
So all the time history of forces and wave and water depth and velocity I show here are before the reflected wave affect the gauges or affect the measurement of forces.
Okay. When you talked about the time it takes for you to do some of the analyses, it looked like there were several hours to compute the 2D model. And you said that was for one core. Is that one core on your laptop, or is that one core of a supercomputer? Where are you running these?
Oh, so for the 2D model, so that's one core actually on my laptop. I actually run the 2D model. The result I show here is actually from several runs on my own laptop. Okay. So it's pretty cheap.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we've reached the conclusion of today's Early Career Researcher Forum. On behalf of the attendees, thank you, Sean, for taking the time to share your research. To the attendees, thank you for your participation and your questions. Please check the SimCenter's website at simcenter.designsafe-ci.org and check your inbox for emails from announce@designsafe-ci.org that will have registration links for additional upcoming webinars in the Early Career Researcher Forum and the Natural Hazards Engineering 101 webinar series. Thank you for attending today's forum.